Hello and welcome to Moneylife. This is Sucheta Dalal. It's a festive season, so let's talk about something positive. We're talking about minority investors making a difference where corporate resolutions are concerned, and to my mind, it's going to start a good governance revolution. Hopefully. Okay? We have to live in hope in India. So why are we saying this? Over the past few years, 80 odd companies have had their corporate resolutions overturned by what is called shareholder activism. So this is basically action by institutional investors and often by retail investors as well. This is a huge difference from what used to happen in the past, and I'm going to explain how things have developed over the last decade. In fact, in a remarkable case last week, Zee Entertainment, which is one of the most profitable and largest news and entertainment companies, had investors vote to say that they were against two independent directors as well as the promoter director who's part of the founder family. This has never happened before, and I think it's a turning point of sorts. This is all part of a movement that began a decade ago. In fact, it gained momentum and was pushed by regulatory actions. For once, we are saying the regulator has done something positive. But the timing is so important because over the last 2 years, in fact, after the pandemic, India has had 15 million new investors entering the market. This is really significant because ever since I can remember, from 1991, when economic liberalization started and you had this giant unit trust of India, the large number of investors, we've always said India's investor population is 20 million. After that, the population declined because you had the big security scam of 92. Then you had the IPO mania, which led to vanishing companies. Lots of companies tapped the capital market, took investors' money and simply vanished. The impact was so huge that retail investors stayed out of the market for a whole decade. So the retail portion of IPOs used to get unsubscribed. And in fact, there were hardly any IPOs for the next 10 years. That's kind of impact the small period between 92 and 94 to 95 had on the entire capital market. Investors just stayed away. Many of them stayed away from the capital market altogether, including the secondary market. They began to slowly come through mutual funds. Even then, the investor population, which had sunk to 8 million, slowly just climbed back to 20. Now, can you imagine 15 million in just under 2 years, which means that India's investor population is set to double. This timing couldn't have been better for shareholder democracy or shareholder activism, whether or not it's led by large foreign institutions. Timing is perfect. It couldn't have been better. In fact, when we report the market today, those of us who've been covering capital markets in the 80s have the sense of deja vu about the manner in which IPOs are getting subscribed. And so it is a real good feeling for us that companies are not getting away with what they did in the 92-95 period when overnight control over capital issues was removed and people expected that the government is looking and vetting IPOs when nothing of that sort was happening, even though it goes through a SEBI clearance process. So today people are looking at companies themselves. These are investors. Quality of investors has changed. So what are the things that have happened? First, in 2010, SEBI came up with regulations which made it mandatory for mutual funds to vote on corporate resolutions. Part of their fiduciary duty, they could not pretend they don't know what is being resolved. They had to vote and they had to publicize it. Almost immediately, proxy advisors existed all over the world. These kind of rules existed around the world. So we were not inventing anything. So 3 entities which were on the sidelines expecting this rule quickly set up shop. One of them is set up by a former SEBI general manager. So one of them is Investor Advisory Services India Limited. The other is Shareholder Empowerment Services. And the other is InGovern Research Services. Slowly, the pension regulator also made it mandatory for pension funds to look at resolutions, vote on them and publicize it. This happened in 2015. In 2017, the insurance regulator came up with the same rules for insurance institutions. Until this happened, institutional investors had often brazenly either colluded with dubious management or turned a blind eye, not voted, pretended they didn't know what was going on. Or if they didn't like what was happening, the worst that they did was to dump the shares, disinvest and vote with their feet. Retail investors also used to do the same thing. Rather than assert themselves and say, no, a company will follow certain norms. In fact, those interested should look at what happened in the 80s. In fact, the 80s, all institutional investors were owned by the government. Government insurance companies, government mutual funds. The only time they ever asserted themselves was when there was political direction. A powerful prime minister told them what to do. They did this very famously or infamously when Swaraj Paul tried to take over Escorts in 1983-84. Again, when the Ambanis tried to take over Larsen and Toubro. In fact, they even used a subsidiary of Bank of Baroda called Bob Fiscal as the vehicle. Bob Fiscal was later very controversially shut down. What's happening today is so far removed from all of this. It has also been facilitated by EVoting. EVoting has made a big difference because retail investors get a link from the depository, can click on it, go to the AGM and vote online. This means that disparate investors who had no voice, if they felt strongly about it, can come together online and make their voice heard. And they have done this. In fact, they did it in the case of compensation to the managing director, Shobha Kapoor, and the joint managing director, Ekta Kapoor, of a highly successful Balaji Telefilms. So even if it was successful, they said, no, the salaries are out of sync with what everyone's getting. We will not allow it. And this action was mainly that of retail investors. In August this year, shareholders also rejected the reappointment of a very popular, charismatic Sucheta Dalal, who is MD and CEO of Eicher Motors. Their main grouse was not about him being an MD, but about the 10% hike that was being given to him by the remuneration committee. They said this is the middle of a pandemic, profits and revenue are low, the rest of the organization is not getting it. Now, the shareholders are upset. They will have to vote on this again. The management apparently is sticking to its guns and trying to explain, but they are going to come back with a revised remuneration package, and we need to see how that goes. Another big change is, like I said, institutional holding in India. So it's no longer government institutions, large number of mutual funds, they're big players today, and a lot of foreign institutional investors, hedge funds, FIIs, who technically cannot be influenced by the government. So those calls that come from various politicians, powerful ministers, which used to be a problem in the past, luckily doesn't matter to them so much. Now, who are the most important players in this system? Naturally, proxy advisors, because results season and the meetings are all bunched together in one window, and globally, proxy advisors are appointed and they are supposed to advise and look carefully at the resolutions and give a recommendation to the client, which is an institutional investor, about which way to vote. Let's look at what happens. Same proxy advisor is advising multiple institutions. There's also competition among the advisors. If an institution wants to reject the recommendation and side with the management, which is technically supposed to be doing something that's not in shareholder interest, then that institutional investor and the person who heads it would have to come up and make a case and prove that in his fiduciary capacity, him opposing the recommendation, him or her, is actually in the interest of the institution. That's a very difficult proposition. Most people don't do it, which is why proxy advisors have become very, very powerful all over the world, with issues like conflict of interest and things also cropping up. Fortunately, SEBI has been tightening the rules for proxy advisors as well. From the word go, proxy advisors obviously needed to get business, needed to show that there is a need for their work. They made their presence felt. So in 2011 itself, almost in the first year that they've operated, they questioned the appointment of independent directors at Wipro and IDFC. It's unheard of, created front page news on all the business papers, and they had made their mark. They also notched up over the next few years significant victories in United Spirits, a Vijay Mallya company, Siemens, where there was the sale of a metal tech business. In UB, it was related party transactions. They recommended voting against it. And obviously, it led to a public debate on governance issues and what the management was doing. The next big change was the Companies Act 2013. It has empowered shareholders by giving them a say in management decisions. So until Jan 2022, by a simple majority, shareholders are able to vote in directors or vote them out. So 50% of the votes cast is enough for retail investor decisions to prevail. After Jan 2022, it's going to be a special resolution and it will need 75% of the vote cast. So this change in the law, along with e-voting and the fact that you get a link straight to the e-voting site from your depository, has made a big difference in empowering retail investors. And when retail investors and institutional investors are on the same side, obviously things improve and things change. The other major part is that proxy advisors are not the only ones. Proxy advisors are advising institutional investors. But we have some serious forums that have come up online of investors who have got together for value investment. They dig deep into a company, look at its resolutions, look at its business, raw material, exports, taxes, how it is run, what is it doing, and this is shared with a large group. So when a group like this sees an analysis, and there are several forums, very good people who are doing excellent analysis. When this information is shared and when it is easy to vote, I think retail investors are making their presence felt. Good example is Apollo Tyres, where minority shareholders rejected the appointment of the managing director, Neeraj Kanwar, forcing him and his father, Onkar Kanwar, to take a 30% cut in compensation before their appointment was approved in December 2018. Like I said, SEBI is also doing its bit by tightening regulation, keeping an eye on things like conflict of interest, which is what destroyed the whole process of statutory auditors, because consulting arms of the same firms used to get business and then compromise on the statutory audit. So September 2020, SEBI's new guidelines require proxy advisors to share their reports with the company concerned, get their feedback and incorporate any points if they're significant in their final report to the client. These guidelines also require disclosure of potential conflict of interest, which is an important issue which everybody needs to keep tabs on. So, barring exceptional cases, the rejection of management decisions has been on 3 or 4 grounds. Executive compensation is a big issue. It obviously irritates investors, both retail and institutional, and this extends even to stock options that they try to give themselves or give in subsidiary companies. Appointment and reappointment of directors, people who've been too close to them, who've been sort of married to the firm after 10 years, is not something investors like. Related party transactions, corporate actions such as mergers, demergers, debt restructuring, if it's not good for the company, it is attracting attention. 2 exceptions were probably the 2 banks, South-based banks, Lakshmi Vilas Bank. There was a coup of sorts where shareholders did something unthinkable and rejected 7 out of 10 directors who had come up for reappointment, including the statutory auditors. But that is a local community bank, very different. The same thing, a similar thing happened with Dhanalakshmi Bank, where they ousted the MD and CEO Sunil Gurbakshani, and people say South Indian Bank, they felt that the MD did not understand their culture and their way of doing business. But again, shareholder activism and shareholder democracy prevailed. It's only rarely, now we come to what has been making news and why I think it's a turning point, which is Z. It's only rarely that institutional investors have really gone for the kill and asked for the outright removal of a promoter family managing director, as happened in Z Entertainment. It's also happened in Dish TV recently. So the largest institutional investors of Z Entertainment called for an EGM to remove Puneet Goenka as CEO and MD. They had also expressed unhappiness at the attempt to reappoint two independent directors, Ashok Kurian and Manish Chokhani. Both of them stepped down before the EGM, and of course the board is standing by them. It's not something that institutional investors would like. To add insult to injuries, the Zee Entertainment shares rocketed up after this institutional action, which tells you how much of support there is among investors. Now, this case is unique because earlier, like I said, Yes Bank, the largest investor, Dish TV, had wanted the removal of Jahar Goel, who is also a brother of the promoter Subhash Chandra. Case is important. Subhash Chandra has always been controversial, is a member of parliament, close to the ruling alliance, and that's why this action makes news and is significant. More importantly, this was a company which is making a lot of money, but Mr. Subhash Chandra has always been very ambitious, wanting to divert money in all kinds of things, and like a cat with 9 lives has got away. He was deeply into things looked at by the Joint Parliamentary Committee in the Ketan Parikh scam, absolutely got away unscathed. Then, a few years ago, the fact that he had pledged a majority of his holding, he has a large outstanding debt of 11,000 crore, and he had done deals to pledge almost the entire promoter holding and with mutual funds and hide it from the public. In fact, thanks to all this and the controversy that surfaced, the holding of the Zee Group, both in Dish TV and Zee Entertainment, is just 5% and 5.9% respectively, which is why institutional action is feasible. I don't think political interference is going to be so easy because people who have to be pressured will be large institutional investors who are not easily cowed down. Ironically enough, Invesco Oppenheimer, which has set the ball rolling on this, a US-based hedge fund, actually came in August 2019 as a white knight to rescue Zee when the promoters had pledged their holding and they needed to become more debt-free, and the debt was so huge. So we're all going to watch what happens over the next 45 days in the Zee EGM that has to be called. Either the company has to call the EGM or the investors themselves can call it. It's also likely that this action will go through, but we're going to watch because so far in the 35 years that I've covered corporate India, every time investors show that they are going to call the shots, corporate India gets together. They have very powerful industry associations. They have the ear of any government that's in charge, whether it's this or any other combination, alliance, coalition. They are able to influence them, and they come up with ways to cut the powers that investors have. Can they do it again? We are headed for interesting times. Either we are headed for a situation where investors, whether institutional or retail, become increasingly more aware about their rights and aggressive about how companies are run, watch them closely, and demand that they stick to what is good for the company and for investor interest. Or you're going to see a backlash and you're going to see the machinations of corporate India to find a way to weaken the powers that investors have. We are headed for interesting times. These are interesting developments for shareholder activism and corporate democracy, and we should all hope that we are alert and that good governance prevails. If you like what you've heard, subscribe to our channel, spread the word, share the video. Thank you.